Okay, it doesn't sound like it's on. I guess it is. So, no, I'd like to say a special thanks to Bill. Bill contacted me about back in December, right around Christmas time, and has just been marvelous in helping arrange today, and his shuttling me around and about, and has made my trip up to New York incredibly pleasant and a lot of fun. And I also want to thank the Naval Order of the United States, the New York Commandery, for inviting me up here. It's a real privilege and an honor to get to come up today and share this story with you all. Bill was explaining to me that you guys had an event recently with Admiral Roughead, and so it's kind of intimidating to come up here after that. So, but again, a real privilege and an honor. And I'd also like to thank Gypsy Da Silva, who's here today. She's a tireless editor at Simon & Schuster, and who is intimately involved in this book. And I'd like to say thank you to her as well.
I look forward to the next one.
Oh, really?
What is your delivery date?
Next summer. So
I'll hang in.
she's being way too kind. She knows I'm tedious to work with, I'm sure. So, and she's been busy getting the paperback ready, which will come out this summer. So if you didn't get a copy today, it will be out in paperback. So, but thank you. The publication of The Attack on the Liberty represented a significant journalistic undertaking, including some 300 interviews and a review of more than 12,000 pages of documents gathered from 24 archives on 2 different continents. Not only did it involve sort of that journalistic effort, but for me it was a very personal story. It involved an exploration of a part of my own family history. My father, actually, John Scott, was a young ensign on board the Liberty in June of 1967. In fact, June 8th of 1967, the day of Israel's attack on the Liberty, was his 24th birthday. And so he was on his first ship, his second cruise, and he was the damage control officer as well, which you can imagine he had quite a busy day that day. And he was later awarded the Silver Star for his actions that day. And so this project was one that interested me professionally, but also personally. And so it was a real wonderful opportunity for my dad and I to really spend a lot of time together and to do a lot of this research as well. So hopefully my little remote control here will work. I think a lot of folks here know the story of the Liberty, but I'll give you a little bit of a quick background on it. Here's a photograph of the Liberty in 1966, and we may want to dim the lights a little bit. It might make it a little easier to see for some, but if not, actually that's fine. But the Liberty was part of a select group of ships. They were spy ships. It was a program created in the early 1960s by the Navy and the NSA to basically create a fleet of mobile listening platforms. We stole the idea from the Soviets, who at that time had about 40 fishing trawlers that they converted. They filled them up with linguists and eavesdropping equipment and sent them off to harass American military installations. They would come in so close to the Charleston Naval Base that you could actually see them from the pier at Folly Beach. They were often found down around Cape Canaveral for space operations, and they kept one of these ships off of Guam throughout the Vietnam War, where they would radio in the takeoff of bombers as they were heading into Vietnam. And so the United States decided we didn't want to be outflanked by the Soviets, and so we set out to create our own fleet of mobile listening platforms. And in doing so, we wanted non-combatant ships. We didn't want to send destroyers or combatant ships that would be provocative. And so we looked for something that would be benign. And World War II cargo ships were the ideal solution. The Liberty was a converted Victory ship from World War II, and they actually brought it back out of mothballs. They put 45 antennae on top of it, reconverted the cargo hold so that they could put radio receivers and eavesdropping equipment, and then they filled it with linguists and sent it off out into the world. The Liberty and all of its sister ships were named in honor of American cities. In fact, the Liberty was named in honor of 10 American towns and cities at that time that were called Liberty, from South Carolina, North Carolina, to here in New York as well. And so these ships, as part of their benign appearance, they had very little in the way of armament. They carried 4 50 caliber machine guns and some small arms, which would be ideal if you were fighting off some Somali pirates, but not really great for self-defense if you're going up against fighter jets and torpedo boats. The Liberty actually, prior to the Six-Day War, the Liberty was assigned to West Africa. It had made 4 missions where it sort of inched its way along the West African coast, monitoring sort of the forgotten frontier of the Cold War at that time period, monitoring who was up, who was down, what was going on with Soviet penetration, and things of that nature. That changed on May 24th, 1967. The Liberty actually had just arrived at that point in the Ivory Coast when a new set of orders rolled off the teletype. 4 sentences directing the Liberty to immediately depart, head north to Spain, take on new linguists and fuel, and head immediately to the Egyptian coast. At this point, in May of 1967, the reason the Liberty got those orders is that war clouds were brewing in the Middle East. Egypt had begun amassing its forces in the Sinai Peninsula, which is that vast desert region that separates Israel from Egypt. And then they announced they were going to close the Strait of Tiran, which is an important waterway for Israel. It's where they bring in a lot of their oil imports, and it's their access to the trade markets in Africa and in Asia. And war at this time appeared imminent, and the United States wanted a front row seat. So the Liberty was then directed to head there. Liberty proceeded north the road to Spain, took on its supplies, and began its trip across the Mediterranean. On June 5th of 1967, as the Liberty was still crossing the Mediterranean, Israel launched its preemptive war against Egypt. That soon escalated to involve Syria and Jordan as well. So, 3 days later, on the morning of June 8th, and with Israel now emerging as the clear victor in the fighting, the Liberty arrived off the coast of the Sinai Peninsula. At 5:15 on the morning of June 8th, the first Israeli recon plane came out and circled the Liberty. My dad was actually on watch that morning and photographed it, took a bearing on it. That began a steady pattern of observation that would last throughout the day. The State Department, in one of its reports, later determined that as many as 8 recon planes came out over the next 9-hour period, flying at sometimes so close, sailors on board the Liberty said they could actually see the pilots and wave to them. The Liberty sailors took confidence in the fact that the ship steamed in international waters. It was a beautiful day, there wasn't a cloud in the sky, had freshly painted hull numbers and markings, its name stenciled across the stern. The American flag fluttered from the mast. And so they actually, on break, many of them went out and sunbathed. That all changed, however, at 1:58 p.m. when Israeli fighters coming in off of land didn't come in to recon it, but instead opened fire on the ship. They began. They strafed the Liberty from bow to stern with rockets and cannons. Fighters then began to sort of crisscross the Liberty literally every minute. They targeted the bridge, the antennae. They targeted the guns. They then began to go across the ship from the sides, trying to disable the engine room. The second wave of fighter bombers joined the attack shortly thereafter, this time armed with napalm, and literally turned the decks into a 3,000-degree inferno. 3 torpedo boats, one of which you can actually see here, joined the attack at 2:31 p.m., strafing the Liberty with 20 and 40 millimeter cannons and 50 caliber machine gun rounds, firing armor-piercing rounds. In a cruel twist of fate, actually, American naval investigators later determined that some of the munitions fired from the torpedo boats were American-made. At 2:35 p.m., a torpedo hit the starboard side of the Liberty, killing more than 24 men. The Liberty immediately rolled 9 degrees. Its generators shut down, power went out, steering failed as the spy ship became dead in the water. The torpedo boats then continued to strafe the ship, killing the helmsman on the bridge, shooting several life rafts that Liberty sailors had dropped in the water in anticipation of having to abandon ship. This incredibly brutal assault left 34 men dead and another 171 injured. To put that in perspective, 2 out of every 3 men on board the Liberty were either killed or injured. The 67-minute attack would prove to be the bloodiest assault on an American ship since World War II. And this photograph that you can see here, actually, this is shortly after the attack, and it looks like it's tilted a little bit. That's actually the list from where the torpedoes hit. So you're actually looking after the ship here, and you can see a little bit of that list. Okay. Back in Washington, President Lyndon Johnson and his advisors gathered in the Situation Room the morning of the attack, and here's a photograph from that meeting. While relieved that neither Egypt or the Soviets were responsible, Johnson and his advisors realized that an attack by Israel, an ally with a loyal domestic following, raised a host of other complicated foreign political issues for the administration. And that's the president with his back to us. It's important to remember that at that time, in 1967, in June of 1967, America was bogged down by the Vietnam War, where 26 men died each day in the jungles of Southeast Asia. In May of 1967, that number spiked to 38 men a day. Johnson's approval numbers had simultaneously plummeted from 61% in March of 1966 to 48% in May of 67. Those numbers would fall to 39% in August, marking his lowest approval during his 45 months in office. Complicating matters was the fact that American Jews, a powerful and important constituency for Johnson, who was facing re-election in 1968, were at the forefront of the anti-Vietnam War movement. And adding to his frustration was the fact that he had done more than any previous president to improve U.S.-Israeli relations. This memo you see here actually reveals the administration's concern over how Vietnam was hurting Johnson's approval ratings in the Jewish community and what it might mean for possible re-election. It says, quote, "If Vietnam is favorably resolved before the elections, defections among Jews will be minimal. If Vietnam persists, a special effort to hold the Jewish vote will be necessary." So all of these issues helped frame the context for how the Johnson administration would handle the attack on the Liberty in the days and the weeks to come. Nicholas Katzenbach, who had been his attorney general, had recently moved over as the second in command of the State Department. And in an interview at his house, actually in New Jersey, he gave me this quote about it. He said, quote, "It was no help if you had a lot of people getting angry at the Israelis. The Israelis screw up the relations, then the Jewish groups are going to bail out the Israelis. It ends up with you, the administration, having a more difficult situation than you would have otherwise." So the Liberty, now riddled with cannon blasts, its deck soaked in blood, and starboard side ripped open by a torpedo, evolved literally in a matter of hours from a top secret intelligence asset to a domestic political liability for the president. That was evident by the declassification of this memo. This was written on the day of the attack, June 8, 1967, by Dr. Luis Tordello, who was the second in command of the NSA at that time period and is a storied figure in NSA history. And in his memo, he wrote, quote, "Captain Vineyard had mentioned during this conversation that consideration was then being given by some unnamed Washington authorities to sink the Liberty in order that newspapermen would be unable to photograph her and thus inflame public opinion against the Israelis. I made an impolite comment about that idea." So senior American officials went so far as to contemplate scuttling an American ship at sea to protect Israel from the public relations fallout of this attack. Meanwhile, back on board the Liberty that night, the full scope of the human devastation of the attack became clear. Crews converted the mess decks into a makeshift hospital. Mattresses were dragged from nearby staterooms and laid out on the tables to comfort the injured. IV bags, which you can actually see one in the back of that photograph, literally dangled from the overhead fluorescent lights. Uninjured sailors were taught how to wash wounds and sew stitches in one another, and penicillin was diluted with sterile water to make sure that they would have enough for the whole crew. Spearheading the effort that night was the ship's 30-year-old doctor. He'd only completed 2 years of a 4-year surgical residency here at Columbia. He had 2 assistants, 2 medical corpsmen, and that was it. The responsibility for treating 171 injured men fell to these 3 individuals. The rest of the Sixth Fleet remained hundreds of miles to the west, and help would not arrive until approximately 6:30 the next morning, leaving the Liberty crew and its tiny medical staff on its own through what would prove to be a very long night. Many of the sailors suffered horrific injuries, as you might imagine. Shrapnel, gunshot wounds, compound fractures, some amputations. The doctor at one point actually told me that he pulled back a piece of torn scalp on one man's head thinking it would just be an injury and found he actually stared down at the man's brain. He ran out of surgical tubing on another occasion and had to actually insert his finger in the chest wall of one man and roll him on his side and drain the blood. The torpedo blast had even fused the eyelids shut of one of the officers who was in the compartment where it went off. This is a photograph actually up on the bridge of Commander William McGonigal, who was the Liberty's skipper. He has a tourniquet. It's a little tough to see because it's a little dark, but he has a tourniquet around his right leg and he's suffering from a concussion. Sailors were manually moving the rudder actually to help steer the ship, and with the navigation system gone that night, Commander McGonigal actually stretched out on the deck and looked up at the heavens and guided the ship by the stars. This is a breakdown of the number of shell hits investigators later counted in the Liberty. As you can see here, there were 821, with 164 in just the bridge and stack area. Now, I interviewed some of these investigators, and they said that they counted only things that were fist size or larger. So all shrapnel and machine gun holes and whatnot that were smaller than that were simply described as innumerable. But that tally doesn't really do justice to the reality of the attack as captured by these following photos. Many of these were shot soon after daybreak the next morning when Liberty sailors ventured out to sort of check out the damage firsthand. Remember that photograph of Liberty in port in 1966 when it was clean and proper, and then you can see it now in 1967, the bridge black. That's a helicopter from the USS America that's medevacing the injured and destroyer there in the distance. But you can see all the black marks down the side of the ship. Actually, they're shell hits, and that line is oil from where the ship had actually rolled after the torpedo hit. But it gives you a sense of just how beat up the ship was. Here's a shot of the bridge and smokestack, and you can see actually what are literally bowling ball size holes there. And it's a little dark, at least from my perspective, but this is a photo that lends some perspective on just how large some of these shell hits were. This is Dennis Eichelberry. He's a character in the book for those of you who have read it, and you can see the hit next to him is literally head size. This is one of the gun tubs on the bow. Liberty's gunners were killed in the first wave of the attack, and as you can see here, there were two direct hits right on the gun tub. And the next morning, their blood, this is the backside of that same gun tub, still saying the forecastle. This is a photograph of Commander William McGonigal holding up the core of an armor-piercing machine gun round. These rounds, literally, they shattered coffee mugs in the mess deck. He dug that one out of the navigation book on the bridge. They literally lodged in bulkheads throughout the ship. Men in the engine room would later use pliers to wrench them free from the bulkheads. And here's one actually still stuck in the bulkhead. As one of the officers told me, quote, "There wasn't any place that was safe. If it was your day to get hit, you were going to get hit." Here's a photograph of my father. He's inspecting it. That's a shoring job that the damage control party put together. And behind that actually is a flooded compartment. He's inspecting some cracks they've got there. The letter there next to it is to give you a little bit of personal family story. When I began research on this project in 2006, my grandmother passed away. My father and his brothers were cleaning out their house in Charlotte, North Carolina, and we're up in the attic and found an old trunk and opened up that trunk, and in it found one of his sea bags. And inside that were 75 letters that he had written to his parents, and then their responses to him throughout this entire period. Many of those letters are quoted in the book. And but this is actually the letter my father wrote some 36 hours after the attack to his parents, and you can see it's written on stationery of the Liberty stationery, and he starts off, "Dear family," and then in all caps, "I am alive and unhurt." Within hours of the attack, Israel apologized, blaming it on a series of tactical blunders that resulted in its forces mistakenly concluding that the Liberty was an Egyptian horse and troop transport, a fraction of the spy ship's size. It was an explanation, however, that many in Washington found difficult to believe. The day after the attack, President Johnson gathered in the cabinet room, pictured here, with his advisors on the special committee of the National Security Council. These declassified handwritten meeting minutes, pictured here, show that the Liberty was the subject of heated discussion as Johnson's advisors spurned the idea that this was a tragic accident. Clark Clifford, who was head of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board and one of Johnson's most pro-Israel advisors, demanded that the attackers be punished. And his strong comments on the Liberty, echoed by many of the others on the meeting minutes that were there that day, reflect a hostility that was never shared with the American public at that time. As Clifford said, and I've translated it there because the handwriting's so bad. And it's amazing to think, on a side note, that the National Security Council meeting minutes were recorded by hand in such poor handwriting. But he said, quote, "My concern is that we're not tough enough. Handle it as if the Arabs or the USSR had done it. Manner egregious, inconceivable that it was an accident. 3 strafing passes, 3 torpedo boats. Set forth facts, punish Israelis responsible." And in the left-hand corner, you can see, it's hardly legible, but it says, "President subscribed 100%. So, to senior administration officials, the idea that the attack on the Liberty was a case of friendly fire seemed to defy logic. Friendly fire incidents tend to happen in bad weather at night. They tend to be over in a matter of seconds, maybe minutes. The attack on the Liberty, in contrast, happened on a sunny day in international waters. It went on for 67 minutes. It involved two branches of Israel's vaunted military. In the heat of battle, Liberty officers were able to identify the hull and flag on a small, swift-moving Israeli torpedo boat, but Israeli naval forces said they couldn't identify the Liberty's man-sized hull numbers and American flag. So to many, that just seemed impossible. And Secretary of State Dean Rusk captures that in this quotation, in which he said,